What if I told you that America didn't become rich after World War II just because it won the war? What if the real reason had nothing to do with factories, soldiers, or even innovation? What if the wealth explosion that turned the United States into a global superpower began with a quiet financial agreement signed behind closed doors while the world was still burning? Because in 1944, before the war even ended, something happened that reshaped global money forever. And most people have never heard of it. Welcome to its financial history too. To understand how America became rich after World War II, we need to rewind to a world in ruins. By 1945, Europe was devastated. Cities were rubble. Industries were destroyed. Infrastructure was shattered. Britain was bankrupt. France was crippled. Germany was flattened. Japan was burned to the ground. But the United States? It was untouched. Its factories were intact. Its cities stood tall. Its workforce was massive. During the war, American industrial production had doubled. The U.S. was producing planes, tanks, ships, steel, oil at a scale the world had never seen. By the end of the war, the United States held nearly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. But here's the twist. Gold alone doesn't make you rich. Control over the global financial system does. And that's where the hidden deal begins. In July 1944, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire. The war wasn't even over yet, but they were already planning the post-war world. This conference would become known as the Bretton Woods Conference. On the surface, it was about stability, preventing another Great Depression, avoiding currency chaos, promoting trade. But underneath, it was about something much bigger. At the center of the debate were two key figures: British economist John Maynard Keynes and American official Harry Dexter White. Keynes wanted a neutral global currency, something independent of any one nation. White had a different vision. He wanted the US dollar to sit at the center of the system. And America had leverage. Europe needed money to rebuild. The United States had the gold, the factories, the credit, the power. The deal that emerged changed everything. Under the Bretton Woods system, global currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. In simple terms, the dollar became as good as gold. But here's the hidden advantage. Other countries needed dollars to trade, to rebuild, to stabilize their currencies, and the only place to get dollars was America. This created an unprecedented demand for US currency worldwide, cause and effect. Because the dollar was tied to gold, countries trusted it. Because countries trusted it, they held it in reserves. Because they held it in reserves, they financed American power. This wasn't just a currency agreement. It was the birth of dollar dominance. Now enter the next phase. The rise. Europe needed rebuilding, and the US stepped in with the Marshall Plan in 1948. Over $13 billion more than $150 billion in today's money was sent to Western Europe. Sounds generous. But there was a strategic mechanism underneath. Much of that money had to be spent on American goods, American machinery, American exports. Europe rebuilt. American companies boomed. And the dollar circulated everywhere. By the 1950s, the United States accounted for around 40% of global industrial production. It dominated manufacturing, oil, automobiles, technology, and finance. Institutions born out of Bretton Woods, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, further cemented America's financial influence. Because voting power inside these institutions was tied to financial contributions. And the largest contributor was the United States, so the system reinforced itself. Countries borrowed dollars, trade was settled in dollars. Oil began to be priced in dollars. Central banks stockpiled dollars. America wasn't just rich. It became the banker to the world. But here's where the breaking point begins. The system worked as long as the US had enough gold to back its dollars. But in the 1960s, something changed. America was spending heavily on social programs and on war, especially the Vietnam War. Dollars flooded the world. Foreign governments began to notice something unsettling. There were more dollars circulating than gold sitting in Fort Knox. If every country demanded gold for its dollars, the US wouldn't have enough. And then came the moment. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made a shocking announcement. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The gold window was closed. This event, often called the Nixon shock, effectively ended the Bretton Woods system. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by confidence. Many predicted collapse. Instead, something unexpected happened. The dollar remained dominant. Why? Because by that point, the world was already locked into using it. Oil-producing nations continued pricing oil in dollars. Global trade contracts were written in dollars. Debt was denominated in dollars. Central banks were filled with dollars. This created a new phenomenon: the ability of the United States to run persistent trade deficits without facing the same consequences other nations would. Cause and effect again. Because the world needed dollars, America could print them. Because America could print them, it could finance deficits. Because it financed deficits, it sustained military and economic dominance. But there were consequences. Manufacturing slowly moved overseas. Financialization increased. Debt levels rose. The fallout wasn't immediate, but it was structural. The 1980s saw rising financial markets. The 1990s saw globalization surge. The 2000s saw credit expand rapidly. And then came 2008. The global financial crisis exposed another paradox. The crisis began in America. Yet during the panic, global investors rushed into dollars. The very system that amplified risk also reinforced dollar demand. By 2024, the dollar still accounts for nearly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves. Almost 80 to 90% of global trade is invoiced in dollars at some stage. This dominance traces back not just to military power, but to a financial architecture built in 1944. But here's the uncomfortable question: can it last forever? Debt to GDP in the United States is far higher than in the 1950s. Geopolitical. Rivals are exploring alternative payment systems. Some countries are experimenting with trade outside the dollar system. We are witnessing small cracks. But history shows something fascinating. Once a currency becomes embedded in global trade networks, replacing it becomes extremely difficult. The British pound once held similar dominance before World War I. After the war, it never fully recovered its global status. The transition from pound to dollar didn't happen overnight. It took decades in a global conflict. So here we are. The hidden financial deal that made America rich wasn't just about gold. It was about designing the rules of the system. First, tie the world's currencies to yours. Then tie your currency to gold. Then, when necessary, remove the gold but keep the network intact. It was a sequence of cause and effect that compounded over decades. Now let's close with 3 clear takeaways. First, winning wars can create opportunity, but controlling the financial system creates lasting wealth. Military victory set the stage. Bretton Woods rewrote the rules. Second, reserve currency status is power. It allows a nation to borrow cheaply, run deficits longer, and influence global trade flows in ways others cannot. Third, systems don't collapse the day they break. They evolve. The end of gold backing in 1971 didn't destroy dollar dominance. It transformed it. But here's the warning. Every dominant financial system in history eventually faces strain from debt, overreach, or rising challengers. The real question isn't whether the system will change. It's how and who benefits when it does. Because the next hidden deal may already be forming. And when it happens, most people won't notice until the consequences are everywhere. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. These stories shape the world you live in, even if they're rarely discussed openly. And in the next video, we'll explore what could replace the dollar, and whether history is about to repeat itself.